Hello, in this video I want to talk about the verses just preceding Isaiah 53. Right, so we're just coming near the end of Isaiah 52. Right, and Isaiah 53 is considered a messianic passage, and the Christians believe it is a description of Jesus, right? And that will include the verses beforehand that I'm going to talk about in Isaiah 52, right? So it's just merging together. Because originally the scriptures didn't have chapter divisions. This was brought about through the monks when they were sort of laying out the Bible, and they obviously perhaps trying to make it easier for people to find their place, and as people do, they, in churches they're looking at chapters all the time. So it's a way of trying to make it easier for people to find their way around the Bible. So it's the monks that have given the chapter divisions, right? So we're just beginning Isaiah 53 about Jesus, and we've got Isaiah 52, which is these verses are considered by Christianity to be relating to Jesus. They interpret these verses as relating to Jesus. So I'm just going to give you a paraphrase because you all know it. You get your Bibles out and your different translations. You'll get the gist of it and the feel of it. So his appearance was so marred, he was so disfigured that this servant couldn't be recognizable. It wasn't recognizable. It was so disfigured. It was in such a state, this servant, that it was unrecognizable. And of course, the first thing the Christian thinks of is Jesus. They think of Jesus. They think of the beatings and the floggings that Jesus had prior to being crucified, right? But I want you to think through this assumption that these words of a figurative of somebody being disfigured, and the appearance was like, couldn't recognize them. So we all know that phrase doesn't necessarily mean that it's Jesus, right? We're all familiar with this turn of phrase. You could hardly recognize him. There are people held all over the world, are taken into custody by police, and they are given such a beating that relatives and people see them and they say, oh, I didn't recognize him. It was terrible. It was such a state. I didn't recognize him. It was awful, awful, awful. Now, this is a turn of phrase. You have to get that. The way we use that expression in our language, it's a turn of phrase to say it was so bad, the beating, that I could hardly recognise him. It's like, I couldn't recognise him. It's like, no, I can't believe this is my son who's just been beaten up. I wouldn't have, it's the disfigurement and the brutality that's been done to them has been so bad that they just say, it's unrecognisable, it's unrecognisable. And this is all over the world, and continuing for the last 2,000 years. There are people, held regimes and they're beaten to a pulp and disfigured and all sorts. And also war does that to people, and people say, I couldn't recognise him, he came back from war and he was totally, the injuries were terrible, and I wouldn't have known it was my son, I wouldn't have known it was my husband, I went to the hospital. So we use this as a turn of phrase, right? How we use language. Now, you have to remember, first of all, that Jesus would have got a beating, and obviously he would have been in a right state. He was held in custody, probably very little water, food, he would have smelt, he would have been absolutely filthy, he would have stank, he would have obviously beaten, scourged, absolutely brutal, the marks on his back and everything, really, really horrible. The crown of thorns pressed on his head, so it's what a sight he would have looked. And the exclamation, as you can imagine, a relative, somebody seeing him there, I can't believe this is my son. No, I couldn't recognise him. I couldn't recognise him. He was so beaten up. The Romans had beat him up so much I couldn't recognise him. That is a turn of phrase. She doesn't actually mean she doesn't recognise Jesus. They recognised him, obviously, but it's a turn of phrase that people use when people have been invariably beaten up, or they've been in a road crash, or suffered the effects, awful things happen in war, and they come back looking different. They're looking very different to their normal selves. So this is why people use this phrase, and it's unrecognisable. I wouldn't have, if I'd seen him in the street, I wouldn't have thought it was my son. And because what they're trying to convey to you is the impact it's had on you, that you're used to seeing your son looking a certain way, and suddenly you see him brutalised. He's been beaten up by the Romans, and he's in a right state. There's no doubt about that. Now we are surrounded with the Christian story in our lives from childhood, and whether it's through television, the media, churches, the imagery of the crucifixion, the crucified Christ has been everywhere, and we've all been exposed to it since we've come out of nappies, out of diapers. It's all around us. You can't escape it. And so we're familiar with this Christian story, and it's not unfeasible that when you read something like that, your first thought would be, who does it remind me of? And you might well think of Jesus, because that is one person that somehow, the advertising, and is advertising around you, suggests that this figure has been brutalised, which, it obviously was beaten up and everything. We're not denying that. No. But you're not necessarily thinking of somebody from the First World War who's beaten up and is unrecognisable. Somebody who comes back from the Falklands War and is burnt and is not recognisable. You're not thinking, when you read those words, of somebody in a road crash who has it's appalling injuries. And you're reading this all the time, aren't you? It's terrible what people suffer and how people are disfigured. But people aren't thinking that when they read these words in Isaiah 50. They're not thinking of the World War I, they're not thinking of the Falklands War, they're not thinking of Vietnam, unless you were there. What they immediately think of is Jesus, and this shows you that advertising works. The culture that you live in, what has been thrust upon you and is all over the place. And even if you lived in the former Soviet Union, where they've tried to deny the existence of God, the images of the crucified Christ were everywhere in the churches and museums, because the Soviets prided art. I was there, visited the Soviet Union. They love art, and they preserve all these images of the crucified Christ. I have never seen so many images of Jesus in a week as I saw when I visited the former Soviet Union in the 1970s. You couldn't get away from him. It was like a competition between Jesus all over the place, in the museums and in the churches, which people could go into and look at the stained glass and things. And Lenin, I came back sick of the sight of both of them, to be honest, because it was everywhere. It was ironic. That's what struck me about the former Soviet Union. You couldn't escape this Christian image, because they're very proud of all these paintings in the Hermitage in former Leningrad, now called St. Petersburg, which is obviously its original name. So you can't escape this, so it's not surprising if people read that. They say, oh, that's, and you immediately think of Jesus. The fact that you immediately think of Jesus doesn't mean it is Jesus. It doesn't mean it is Jesus. It just means the advertising's actually worked. Because you're not thinking of World War I, are you? You're not thinking of people come back from the Falklands War. And things like that, but you immediately think of Jesus. Now, what you have to remember, and I'm not being mean about this or underplaying his sufferings or everything, but Jesus was recognisable. You have to remember that. He would have been recognisable. He would have been recognisable. The shock of seeing somebody beaten up, right? means that the first reaction people say, oh, I wouldn't have known him. I couldn't have believed it was my son. I wouldn't have believed. I can't believe it's him. You know, you're so shocked at the altered state of the person that you use this phrase. I wouldn't have thought it was him. It's unrecognizable. This is a turn of phrase. You have to understand that Jesus would have been recognizable. Now, I want you to contrast this with other images that you might have not thought of. I have spent the last 20 years researching the Holocaust, and I have also done a lot of research into real crime. Real crime. Not the films, not the books, not the videos, not the TV programmes. I am telling you, as an avid reader of crime fiction, I like crime fiction as well, an avid reader of crime fiction as well, that the reality of the brutality of war, of torture, of crime is far worse than you could ever read about in a crime fiction or what you see on television. You think you're seeing the very worst at the X-rated films, but the reality is, when you research in depth, thoroughly, in great detail, real crimes and what real people do to each other, and when you research the World War I, World War II, when you research the Holocaust and awful atrocities like that, and every war is an atrocity and it's terrible, people do become literally unrecognisable. In other words, you cannot recognise them. The police often have to go to scenes of crime where they cannot recognise a body. The fire brigade, the fire people, the fire service go into properties after a fire and they find bits and pieces and they cannot recognise what this bits and pieces is. It looks like it's a leg. We don't know what that is over there. They have to take all the debris, take it away, and it has to be examined by forensic science. And the reality of real crime and the real world war and the Holocaust is you don't recognise people. You don't recognise people. You don't recognise them. You don't recognise the person who has been gassed and burnt. So the person is burnt, they're gassed and then they're burnt, and you look and it's unrecognisable. It's unrecognisable. You can go to sites and see the ashes, but you don't see any bodies. You see the ashes and you say, well, where's the person? But it is integrated. It is unrecognisable. You cannot recognise it. It's totally not, you can't recognise anything. You cannot recognise it. When somebody's burnt alive, they become totally unrecognisable. And the police come and say, they don't know who it is. Are there any teeth? Can we trace it through the... And many crimes, the police can't. They don't know who it is. They don't know who it is. They don't know who it is, and they can't trace it. They can't use anything because the body is totally beyond recognition. This is not a turn of phrase that we use when somebody's being beaten up. You know, oh, it was in a terrible state. It was unrecognisable. No, real crime, real war, the Holocaust meant that when people were gassed and then they were burnt, and people were burnt alive as well, you wouldn't know them. You wouldn't know them. You wouldn't know them. You could see a pile of corpses. You try identifying a relative. You try identifying a relative. That is what it means to be unrecognisable. That's what it means to be unrecognisable. It is when there is no... It's totally changed. It's like when you get the ashes of somebody who's died. It's the same. It's exactly the same. It's totally different. It's totally different. And so we have to really rethink the way that we read scripture. And the fact that we immediately think of one thing doesn't necessarily mean it is the one thing that we're thinking of, because advertising works. This is the Christian image of the crucified Christ, that you think that this Christ who was crucified meets that image of something so disfigured it was unrecognizable, right? I am saying not necessarily, because really he would have been recognizable. He would have been recognized. If you see anybody being crucified, and they will have been beaten before, they're not just taken and crucified, they will have got beatings before. You have to understand the brutality of regimes. They do torture people. They torture people. They torture people. And can be a long process. And then they might decide to just hang them after they've tortured them. Or they might decide after they've tortured them for so long and they can't get information out of them, they then crucify them. Right? But the relative would probably be able to recognise the person. But it would just be shock and like, I can't believe this is my son. I can't believe this is my son. So you're kind of using that turn of phrase, like, it's unrecognisable. But he would have been recognisable. Jesus would have been recognisable. So what I'm saying is those words don't actually fit Jesus. It sounds like it could be Jesus. And that's because of advertising. That's your first image. But if you've been in Vietnam and you read those words, you will be thinking of the person you saw burnt alive. A bomb's gone, blown up, whatever. The person has been blown to bits. You read the World War I and you read the accounts of people seeing somebody next to them being blown to bits. Blown to total bits. That's unrecognisable. That's unrecognisable. That's unrecognisable. Being beaten and scourged, although horrible and terrible in itself, and then being put up on a cross and crucified, is not being unrecognisable. It's, when you're thinking of it literally, it meets probably other things more than Jesus, to be honest. And this is I'm not trying to downplay the sufferings and the state he would have been in. He would have been in an awful state, but he would have been recognisable. But to a relative or a friend, just seeing Jesus on the cross, they would feel he's unrecognisable. Oh, look at him! Look at the state of his face! Look at his back! I wouldn't have known it was myself. But of course they recognise him. But in true crime, in true atrocities like the Holocaust, World War I, people being blown to bits, people do. You can't find them. You can't find them. What's that over there? What's that over there? What is that over there? And that is why I was doing all my research. I had to stop it, because real crime, real things that are disfigured beyond the pale, and it bears no resemblance to a human being and all of that. When you're reading about this factually, it's just so overwhelming that you just have to stop, because it is so awful. I've been reading crime fiction for years, right? And there is nothing that compares to the reality of true crime and true atrocities done to human beings through war and torture and the Holocaust and all sorts of horrible things that people do to each other. Publishers wouldn't publish it because it wouldn't become bestsellers. In other words, even the writers of crime fiction, know there's only so far they can go. There's only so far they can go. Because it's sort of beyond the pale. So you think you're reading crime fiction and you think that's grotty. You think that's terrible and beyond the pale. You go to the X-rated films and you think you've seen the worst. You have seen nothing until you've been out on the battlefield, until you've read all the details about the Holocaust, of what people do to each other, and all the other horrible atrocities, including that the church have done to people, to each other, torturing people, tearing people to bits, getting the dogs to pull them to bits, and So I hope this video has been helpful in getting you to rethink your assumptions and look at things from a realistic point of view and say, first of all, you should be looking at those words within the context of not only the whole of the chapter, inverted commas, but the whole of the book. You cannot just come into a book in the middle and think you've got it. It's ludicrous. You have to start at the beginning. You have to start at the beginning of Isaiah. It's not enough to just go and cherry pick verses and think, it's relating to this. You have to look at the whole concept. You have to look at the scripture within the whole concept. Forget the chapter divisions. Forget it. You need to go back to the beginning of Isaiah and read it from beginning to end. From beginning to end. That's the only way that you will be able to possibly make more sense of it. And you also need to listen and to consider the rabbis and the sages for whom the Hebrew scriptures belong to. These scriptures belong to the Jewish people. These are the scriptures of the Jewish people, of now hundreds of thousands of rabbis, right, have been reading Isaiah, right, the book of Isaiah, right. We are the people of the book. We are the people of the book. We know our scriptures. And we don't need evangelical Christians who really don't know much, really very little about the scriptures, and not Jewish. They haven't had any training. They don't understand the book. They might have their points of view, but they seem to exude an authority and a supremacy over the rabbis, that they understand the Hebrew scriptures better than the Jewish people. And I find this extremely an audacity. I think you've got to cheat, quite honestly. You are so arrogant, you Christians, that you presume the Jewish people, the rabbis, learned people, we're known as the learned people, cannot understand our own scriptures. Of course we understand our own scriptures, and when we look at scriptures like Isaiah 53, Isaiah 52, and all that I'm talking about, we look at the whole book. We look at everything within context. Right? We are not idiots, and we're not spiritually blind. We are very, very, very smart people. And don't patronise us thinking you, who really know very little, and come from a culture where you don't think around the box, you don't examine things deeply, you don't question nothing, have the cheek to lecture the rabbis on their own scriptures, of which we know. These are our scriptures. And if there's anything you need to learn and listen to the rabbis. Because These are our scriptures. This is our heritage. And hundreds of thousands of rabbis, all independent. Now we've got the women with the, looking at these scriptures, and they do not see Jesus. They do not see Jesus. It doesn't add up. It doesn't add up. And I think if you claim Judaism is the root of Christianity, if this is true, then you need to re-examine the Hebrew scriptures within context, and you need to listen to the rabbis. You need to listen to the rabbis. And I would recommend you, highly recommend you, two rabbis who know the Hebrew scriptures inside out, back to front, and your New Testament. Rabbi Tovia Singer, Rabbi Michael Skobac. You can go to Jews for Judaism. You can go to Outreach Judaism. Why don't you listen to the rabbis? Why don't you listen to the rabbis and what they have to say about the Hebrew scriptures and what they mean? Why are you hanging on the opinions of one mere rogue Jew, St. Paul, whose faith was not rooted in the Hebrew scriptures but is rooted in a spiritual experience? St. Paul knew from studying Isaiah 52:53 that Jesus was not and could not be the Messiah. He also understood that some of the things that Jesus was saying were absolute blasphemy. Blasphemy! Blasphemy! That's why St. Paul was so angry, right? But he has a spiritual experience, and based on that spiritual experience, he now believes from this spiritual experience that Jesus is the Messiah. So his faith, the root of St. Paul's faith, is not based in the Hebrew scriptures. It's based on a spiritual experience. And this is continued. It's continued with Professor Michael Brown, who at the age of 16 stepped forward in a church to the altar call and had a spiritual experience. And based on that spiritual experience, he put his faith in Jesus and he investigated Christianity, and he's on board with Christianity. So Professor Michael Green and St. Paul are identical. Their faith is based at root on a spiritual experience, and it's a spiritual experience that has affected their judgment of the Hebrew scriptures. And I'm telling you, as somebody who's had spiritual experiences, and I'm sure you've had them, they are very, very compelling and very convincing, and they can hold you like nothing else can, and you can find yourself in so agreement with the spiritual experiences that you refuse to reflect, to accept the reality of the Hebrew scriptures, when it's plainly obvious that the Hebrew scriptures contradict your spiritual experience. The Hebrew scriptures contradict the spiritual experience of Paul. Paul knew from Isaiah 53, 52, everything. He knew Jesus was not the Messiah. He knew it. That's why he was persecuting the early believers. I mean, that's the wrong thing to do. There's no evidence that was endorsed by the Jewish community. No, this is a rogue man, a passionate character, a law unto himself. We all agreed St. Paul has got a strong-minded individual. He's got a big ego. He's very opinionated. He's arrogant. He's very, very extreme. Paul is the extremist. And in his extremism, and he's suddenly, persecuting the early believers, and then he has a spiritual experience and everything changes. So I do hope that you found this discussion interesting, thought-provoking, and that you will consider listening to the rabbis at Jews for Judaism here on YouTube, and also Outreach. And I thank you for listening to me.